I want to paint you a picture. Imagine your players are plumbing the depths of an ancient tomb in a hostile part of your game world. As they go in search of dark secrets and ancient magics, they come upon walls inscribed in a long-lost tongue that none of them can hope to read. They continue on and they're faced with hostile architecture, strange features, and geometric obscenities that only serve to increase their curiosity about what lies beyond. They come to the tomb's treasure only to find it's not gold, glory, or anything helpful. It is a curse that lays waste to their minds and bodies before rendering them unto dust. And this might sound like the elements of a fantasy story, but there is a dungeon like this that exists in the real world. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle, and welcome to Desks and Dorks. Today, we are going to be covering the dungeons that exist in the real world, but specifically some of the most terrifying. This is the third part of a video series I didn't intend to do, but the response to these has been so positive, I couldn't help myself, and so I decided I'd run it back one more time. With that being said, however, a couple things. If you like the work that we do, the work of blending history and tabletop role-playing games, a couple things you can do to help. All of the YouTube pleasantries go a long way, but we have a Patreon if you would like to support the work that the channel does for $10 a month. You get your name in the credits, you get an RPG that I make special for our patrons every month that you can't get anywhere else, and you get early access to our content. It's a pretty good deal. If you want digital copies of our commercially available games, you can get them over at itch.io, and if you want physical copies, you can pick them up from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. Links to all of those in the description below. But with that out of the way, let's talk about that dungeon that we started with, the one that I told you really does exist. The illustration that you're looking at right now does not come from a fantasy game manual. It does not come from the work of Gary Gygax, and it doesn't come from some fantastic purveyor of indie RPGs like myself. No, this is a concept sketch for a real-life nuclear bunker, an installation that is going to be basically created in the New Mexico desert to hold tons upon tons of depleted uranium, the fuel used in both civilian and military nuclear programs throughout the United States. These hostile obelisks are meant to ward off individuals, to show them, or perhaps give them some indication that the place they are entering is a dangerous one. In addition to these obelisks, walls written in several different languages, including Russian, American, and Navajo, are going to be placed both outside and inside the site, warning that there is nothing of value within this place. However, that the person who is reading it should get the heck out as soon as humanly possible. And on top of all of that, it's going to be combined so that these features, these strange alien features, will continue at the top and into the bunker itself, even after the bunker has been intentionally collapsed and filled with salt. This is not the purview of a fantasy role-playing game. No, my dear friends, this is in fact a real place. This is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant here in the United States. I first heard about this, and I'm going to give a huge shout out here to Jacob Geller, who is a video essayist who primarily works in the realms of video games, not necessarily tabletop games. I watched one of his videos on spelunking and why human beings seem to be drawn to the depths of the dark, and I thought this was such a fascinating thing. I revisited the video recently after I had started to do this series, and I realized that this is probably the most terrifying dungeon imaginable. It is miles below the surface. There's literally a labyrinthine nest of tunnels and ideas. It's everything that you have come to expect from a dungeon. Catacombs miles below the surface, protected not just by these strange alien features and by the tons of rock and salt that they will use to hopefully keep the uranium away from the water and away from the surface, but it's probably protected at this point. Who knows what will happen to the United States in 1,000 years, and it's possible and plausible that maybe in the event of catastrophic societal failure, another group of people decides that this is an important religious site or political site and is set to protect it. It is literally the poster child for a dungeon, and I think if you are going to gamify this particular site in your games, I think the best way to do so is to lean into the idea that radiation kind of works like a curse. Every level that the players think that they're getting closer and closer to their treasure, to some sort of eternal, important reward, they're forced to give up something. Part of their max health, part of their abilities, an upgrade that they have learned, a spell that they have access to, a companion, perhaps. And eventually, the players have nothing else to do but sacrifice themselves, and in the end, I don't think the players should get anything for this. I think if you're going to lean into this particular type of a game, I would treat this not like a horror RPG entirely, but very much a horror adjacent one, where the players think that they're going to be getting something incredible, but are really just moving towards their own demise. I think this is a critical component and a great way of leaning into what I think is one of the most interesting and intriguing spots in the United States and in the world in general, as we compare it to those things like fantasy dungeons. Now, I've intentionally mentioned horror RPGs here because I'm going to be leaning in on one that I didn't think I was going to talk about, and that, my dear friends, are insane asylums. On some level, the United States is dotted with many of these facilities. These are not just kind of the poster children for everything that you would come to expect about a dungeon. A dark backstory, for example, numerous buildings, again, a labyrinthine set of architecture, and filled with the remnants of the things they've left behind. You would think, on paper, that this is a perfect place to start if we're going to be talking about modern dungeons. However, in order for me to actually talk about these things, I have to talk about the vast amounts of societal injustice that has gone along with the mental health care system, particularly here in the United States. Because the truth is, as cliched as it might sound, the real monsters are often people running the asylum. Mental asylums, and indeed the mental health system in the US in general, was not a typical place or a place of help or, shall we say, rehabilitation for its patients for much of the mental health system's history here in the US. This was a dumping ground for children that you did not want, for labor organizers, for dissidents, for quote-unquote undesirables, and a number of horrific crimes and human rights violations occurred in these places. Things like forced lobotomies or chemical castrations are unfortunately very common in this time period, and as amazing as getting a chance to use real-life examples in our games is, I hesitate to talk about or use this as an example because of how tragic it was for the individuals affected and how this early example has sort of stigmatized how we treat and approach mental health here in the States, as well as the individuals who are in most dire need of it. And as such, I'm going to do two things for you. One, I would suggest safety tools or communication tools if you're going to be running a campaign centered on a mental asylum. And two, I would not make this a typical dungeon crawl. I would make this a dungeon escape, or a prison break, so to speak, right? I mentioned earlier that political dissidents, labor organizers, and just in general people who made a little too much noise about injustice were often the people dumped in these sites. And again, a large portion of the LGBTQ+ community gets put here too in the early stages of the mental health system. And so I think it's a great place for you as a game master to allow your players to break those individuals out and help them gain a little bit of justice. Maybe, the quote-unquote the real treasure was the friends you made along the way, or in this case, the real treasure was springing out people who desperately needed to escape and didn't belong there in the first place. I've enclosed a picture of a Boy of Silence from one of my favorite games, BioShock Infinite. This actually, I think, does a really good job of illustrating what happens when a mental health system is used as a tool of punishment and oppression rather than one that helps its patients recover and move forward. These are political dissidents and prisoners who have been essentially retrofitted with this equipment and thrown into an asylum where eventually they're broken and become their own jailers and the jailers of all those who would return there in the future. This is a great thing, I think, to use for your inspiration, but again, please make sure that you're being respectful of the source material and respectful of your players if you are going to delve into this particular topic. I thought about doing a longer video, and let me know in the comments below if you would like me to do one. This is a topic that I think needs a lot more nuance if we're going to tackle it from a gameplay perspective, but I wanted to include it here because it is a good example. But again, be respectful of the source material and be respectful of your players. I think it matters a ton. And last but certainly not least, we go right back to the idea of warfare, but not of disposing of it properly. In the Cold War, Russia opened numerous missile silos, some of which were decommissioned when the armistice was declared in the 80s, when the Russians quote-unquote lost the Cold War, and some of them are lukewarm, shall we say, not fully decommissioned, but still there, and some were in the process of being completed, but were never actually finished. And so essentially what you have is another classic dungeon trope, the idea of a large, like, geographically vast landscape, like Russia and Eastern Europe, that is dotted with silos, or in our case, dungeons, of similar quality and architecture that have long been abandoned by an empire that cannot afford their upkeep and was forced to abandon its outposts. Again, sometimes history and literature, they kind of go hand in hand, which I think is kind of neat. This is a wonderful place because, one, these places are architecturally incredibly striking. You have vast open vistas inside of these silos, and the scope of the facilities themselves can be both daunting and also awe-inspiring in a way that dungeons on par with things like Final Fantasy or Shadow of the Colossus are. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. But also, it leans into this idea that at some point in a fantasy world, an equivalent amount of technology is basically just magic. And that is really what I think I would like you to lean in on if you're going to use these things as mega dungeons in their own right. I love the idea that players are tasked with looking for not full weapons, but components that will later allow them to use those components to augment and upgrade their abilities. This is very similar to the way that fantasy RPG characters find things like magical spell components, potions, or artifacts to help boost their own spells. But in our case, we're using, like, I don't know, Soviet-era targeting technology to make our fireballs a little bit more accurate, which I think is kind of awesome. And I love the idea of a game that plays around with the interplay between magic, technology, and spelunking to make a system that feels wholly organic, and also allows you to skew a little bit closer to the real-world source material. But with that, my friends, I hope this has provided you with plenty of food for thought. That is the end of our video today on some of the scariest mega dungeons that we can find. I thought this was particularly apt because, A, I think the idea of nuclear proliferation is terrifying, the abuses of a mental health system are really scary, and the idea that our society was so close to the brink of war and all-out Armageddon that you can find the last remnants of those dotting a landscape kind of like a dungeon would. These are the reasons I picked those particular three, by the way. But if you like this content, again, a huge shout out to all of you guys for watching. But if you want to support, all of the YouTube pleasantries matter a ton. Again, the Patreon link is in the description below, but that QR code will take you there if I'm one of your second screens, so to speak. If you want digital copies, itch.io is the place to go. They'll hook you up. And if you want physical copies, you can get them from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. Lastly, I'd like to do two more shoutouts. One, I'd like to shout out our Discord. The link is in the description below. If you want to participate in the community and be a Dad Bod member, you can join that. That's absolutely free. It's not gated behind any of the paywalls. And finally, most importantly though, I have to thank our amazing patrons who help bankroll these videos, help me to produce the kind of content that I love making, and make it possible for me to produce extra content like this. So a huge shout out to Dionysus, to Chris Bates, to Agile Monk, and Aiden Delaney. You guys are absolutely amazing. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your support and for allowing me to make this kind of content, the kind of content that I love. Thank you again all so much for joining me. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You've been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.